Welcome, I'm Sam Faddis. This is Ground Truth, and this is the third part of a series that we're doing, the final part, at least for now, that we're doing on organ harvesting in China. And with us, the same gentleman who's joined us before, Ethan Gutman, whose credentials are a mile long. He's a Nobel Prize nominee, amongst other things, author of a sensational, incredibly powerful book called The Slaughter on this topic. Fellow of China Research, Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, co-founder, International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China. As I indicated, particularly last time, when Ethan's talking, he's talking based on a tremendous amount of experience in the field, personal interviews, and real research. This is not a guy repeating to you what he heard from his second cousin who knows a guy who might know something about the topic. This is a gentleman who's been there and done that and taken the time to do his homework. Ethan, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here again, Sam.
So look, you've kind of coined this thing as a way of just sort of for simplicity's sake of looking at this issue as organ harvesting 1.0, which is where we were in the first episode, 2.0 in the second segment, and now I guess we're to organ harvesting 3.0 again. These are just for sake of convenience. And
well, there's a little bit of logic to them because, if you think of them similar to software, and I suppose a couple of people came up with this a while ago, and a little bit like a software program. I mean, organ harvesting 1.0, it's spotty, it's buggy. They're trying all kinds of new things. So there's, the system is constantly being overhauled. Organ harvesting 2.0, it really becomes popular. It becomes a mainstay of the Chinese at least in terms of the economy, at least in terms of medical practices. And then 3.0, we're looking at something that's faster and more efficient.
So you said, I mean, in the course of these of the last segment when you and I were talking, by the time we get into way down into the weeds, I mean, as I think I said on air last time, I thought I had been exposed to a lot of horrifying things in the course of doing what I did for a living for a long time, but this whole thing becomes literally a horror movie. But maybe the most chilling thing you said, which was kind of antiseptic actually, toward the end of the last segment, was you said, and then we come to the point, and I'm paraphrasing obviously, you said, and then we come to the point where we begin to run out of Falun Gong.
Yeah.
And the idea that you've exhausted a supply of political prisoners for organ harvesting is what I found so horrifying. But that's where we broke off last time, is that okay, so with this thing 2.0 is built on organ harvesting largely from Falun Gong political prisoners, prisoners of conscience, and now we're running out of them. So I think we're at about 2015 now. Is that right?
That's right. About 2014, 2015, I think we're starting to run out of. I can't say for sure. Nobody has ever known how many Falun Gong practitioners there are in China at post crackdown. That is post 1999, when it's made into an illegal organization and so forth. And then there's this massive mobilization of society to destroy it. And I say society, but it's mainly the Public Security Bureau of China, and the 610 office, which is specifically created as a subset of the Public Security Bureau to destroy it. But we don't have to get into flowcharts here. I mean, everybody in society, one of the characteristics of Chinese society, and probably a lot of communist societies, is that they try to make everybody get involved, so everybody is kind of guilty or complicit in the thing. So hotels were putting up signs saying no Falun Gong wanted here, and that kind of thing. I mean, really unnecessary stuff. School kids were mobilized to do anti-Falun Gong posters and so forth. This is the way it works. And in workplaces, every workplace in China had to go through a sort of a process where people would talk about how terrible Falun Gong was at the workplace, and would expose anybody that they had known who was Falun Gong, right? Okay, so that's Falun Gong. But at some point, and again, we don't know the numbers, but we start getting the sense that they are starting to run out. And it makes sense because Falun Gong's getting older. Uh, there, there were a lot of young people who were very dedicated to Falun Gong, and some of those people have been harvested. Some of them have made it out of the Laogai system, right? And some have but they're not being replaced. There's not a lot of new Falun Gong coming in and demonstrating and so forth. So they're not catching as many people. This means that you are starting to run out of organs because they're at the same time, there is some evidence that they did reform the system of killing prisoners. That is, not as many prisoners are being executed. Now, we don't know that. That's Chinese numbers, and so we don't want to cherry pick them, right? But at the same time, there's enough information in other sources that is sort of chatter among the doctors and chatter among police officials that suggests that they were somewhat serious about that, of lowering the execution rate of regular prisoners. So you don't have those regular prisoners to fall back on for organs at this point. And this is where I think there's kind of on our side, the investigative side, there's a kind of failing because we did not see this coming. In other words, I certainly didn't. I have always been kind of weirdly optimistic that the Chinese would come under so much fire about this, that Beijing would really, that they were really getting nervous about this whole issue, and that they would put it, phase it out. Much the way they suggested they did in 2015. They say, well, we're not going to harvest organs from prisoners anymore. But one thing happened that should have alerted us was we didn't get any signs of the transplant industry, the hospitals, the transplant wings that were distributed all throughout the provinces of China. There were no sign of them shutting down or scaling back, right? And in fact, the top at the top levels, they'd sort of brag about how their numbers were going up. And that they were going to surpass America as the number one transplant center in the world. They were going to perform more transplant operations. Now, up to this point, they've been denying it. They've been saying we're only doing 10,000 a year. But of course, they're saying now it's all voluntary donations. Well, we knew it wasn't voluntary donations because we had people calling to voluntary donation hotlines in China that were set up in different cities. And we gave them instructions. These were Chinese volunteers, and they'd call every day. They'd call at different times during the day, and nobody would answer. Finally, after a month or a couple of weeks, somebody would answer, and our investigators were instructed to say, "I'd like to volunteer my organs for the state, and I'd like to donate them for when I die. How do I do that? What do I do next?" And they were also instructed after they'd established a rapport to say, how many other people have you gotten calling, the line? How many donors have you gotten? And they'd say, well, 5 or none. And these were in cities of, 10 million people. Okay. So something was terribly wrong here.
Right.
Okay. There was a complete disconnect between what the Chinese were saying. And at that point, we also had evidence from Matt Robertson and Jacob Levine and another fellow statistician whose name I always forget, but it'll come back to me at some point, who basically looked at the Chinese numbers of voluntary donations and were able to show that they were actually based on an equation. They were just an equation that was supposed to show exponential growth. They weren't real numbers at all. Now, that doesn't prove that people aren't volunteering that people are not volunteering their organs, that there are voluntary donors out there. There probably are more. But what is the number? We have no clue, right? And in general, people are not that stupid in China, and they realize they know one thing. People are making a lot of money off this thing, and it's a dirty business. And if you give up your organs voluntarily, you're kind of a sucker, unless it's for a relative of yours.
So where did they
That's
begin to go to? You said we're running out of Falun Gong, but we're not really stopping. So who gets
where
butchered now?
we kind of missed it. I mean, in a way. I mean, I was always maybe more involved than other investigators with the Uyghurs because I was the one who had spearheaded that investigation to see if the Uyghurs had ever been uh, uh, harvested. And we did, and in organ harvesting 1.0, we saw that the Uyghurs were in fact the first population to come under this. Uh, to be harvested, to be experimented on, and so forth. Well, one of the things I'd kind of lost the thread of the Uyghur investigation. What I hadn't realized was the how severe the crackdown had been in Xinjiang. Oh, say from 2012 on. So for quite some years, 3 or 4 years, you had a terrible crackdown. Now, I want to talk about that just for a second, very briefly. You know, I've interviewed a woman. It's going to come out in my next book, who tells a story that is, and I've been through a lot of different stories, but this one is more unbelievable in terms of sort of torture and particularly rape than any story I've come across. I had a hard time getting this one out of my mind after when I interviewed her, and the translator did as well. We both had some real difficulty. We interviewed her in Istanbul, and the stories are. Initially, she didn't give a lot of specifics, but I interviewed her several times. And the last time I did interview her, which was not that long ago, a couple of months ago, I left. I said, listen, I'm going to leave the room. You're a young Muslim woman. I can understand that me being here is inhibiting. And I'm just going to ask you guys to interview on tape. And I'm going to go take a walk. But you need to talk about specifically what happened in every rape. And this is a young woman who was raped when she was 16, 17. She lost her virginity inside a camp for Uyghurs in Xinjiang. She also experienced directly pornographic displays, which I'll get into in the book. I'm not going to get into them here. She experienced another pornographic display that consisted of a snuff display. Okay, a dead woman had been tortured and severely. These things are really unreal. There's no way to obviously to go back and sort of verify them with other people. That's why I interviewed her very, very closely to make sure that I think she's credible. Now, and I did find she was credible. She sometimes screwed up her dates, but that doesn't seem to me to be too big a deal because people do that. What's striking about this, the reason I'm telling you this, is not just for the shock value. It's for the same reason that you have to understand, or the audience has to understand, that this happened to Falun Gong as well. They didn't just start harvesting Falun Gong. First, they went through a period where they tortured them, went further and further in the torturing, more and more deaths due to torture and so forth. So there was a loosening of inhibitions. The inhibitions that normally govern behavior, even in labor camp or prison, were being stretched to the limit. And in this case, particularly sexually, they were crossing all kinds of taboo, sort of various boundaries. The only explanation I want to just make, sort of a suggestion here. The Falun Gong is Chinese. They're Han Chinese. So the sexual, there certainly was sexual abuse, but that was not the main point of what was going on. This is different. There's a dehumanization of the Uyghurs, and it appears to me to not be based on the fact that they're Muslims or anything like that. It appears to be racial. Okay, the reason I say this is because one of the pornographic displays that was done regularly in the prison involved 4 cops, for 3 men, 3 of them Han Chinese men and 1 Uyghur, and then 4 very beautiful Uyghur women who would perform these pornographic displays in front of the prisoners, and then the prisoners would be raped, male and female. That to me, it's really hard to explain that kind of activity without saying this is ethnic, this is racial, this isn't based on, oh, these people are revolutionaries, this isn't based on, these people have a misguided, they're part of a misguided cult or something like that. That's not what's going on here. So I mentioned that because the dehumanization is very important in this case. Because if we're going into organ harvesting 3.0, which might, I don't want to compare it to the Falun Gong and say it's worse or better. That's not, we're not doing that. But, I think it's important to say this dehumanization process was ramping up from 2012 to approximately 2015. And 2015, we start getting the first signs, and we should have read them correctly. We didn't, and we had a year's delay before we understood what was going on. But they were all being given health checks. Everybody in Xinjiang who was Uyghur, who was Hui Muslim, who was Kazakh, who was Kyrgyz, but mainly Uyghur, were all being given mandatory health checks. Now that sounds innocent, but it wasn't. It was basically they were testing the organs of every man, woman, and young adult who was Uyghur in Xinjiang. Up to the age of, if you were below the age of 12, you were exempt from the health checks. Anything above the age of 12, you got the health check. It was mandatory. You had no choice. There were huge crowds that had to descend on the hospitals. We have some films of those. And they'd have to wait in long lines, and they'd get these blood tests. Now, they also got DNA tests, which Human Rights Watch jumped on and sort of said, aha, they're doing surveillance, which is probably true. But it's also true that DNA tests can be used for tissue matching of organs, very successful tissue matching. But particularly, they left out the point that they were doing blood tests. Blood tests are really for tissue matching. There's not really much other use for them. You can try to identify diseases. You can try to identify general health issues. No one I interviewed who's come back from the camps has ever said they were given, oh, they discovered something in the health check and they got back to me. That never happened. These health checks weren't being given. There's another important clue here. Half of Xinjiang, over half, is Han Chinese. They were exempt from the health checks. They didn't have to go to the hospital. So that's pretty significant.
So how many people, just for reference for scale? Okay, we're only testing the non-Han Chinese folks in this province, in this region. How many people is that?
About 12 million to 15 million in there. There's a lot of argument about how many Uyghurs are actually in Xinjiang. I tend to think the Uyghurs are somewhat right that they're being undercounted. I'd say let's go with 12 to 15 million in there. So it's a lot of people. And then if you consider the Han Chinese, that they would probably be another 15 to 20 million, right? Now they're not being tested. So that's fairly significant. These health checks coming out of nowhere. Mandatory. The reason we know about this was because they were talking on their own websites, and their websites were intercepted, and they were bragging about how many people that they were so close to having complete testing of the entire population. Yeah. So this is what we were looking at. That was the first really serious.
When you say they were bragging on their websites, who are we talking?
Oh yes, the Public Security Bureau, and and the military hospitals were bragging about how successfully and how in record time they'd gotten they now had health records for approximately 15 million people. Now that's an incredible stable, if you consider that might be used for organ harvesting. If you just believe that's used for surveillance, okay, you can believe that. Certainly there were problems. There were concerns about Uyghurs and potential terrorism and so forth. But I don't believe that's what was going on at all. The tests were done. There was a urine test, an EKG, usual probing of various probing of the abdomen, the lower abdomen. So they were looking at kidneys and liver. Now, were they preparing to start just killing these people off? No, probably not. But the same thing had been done to Falun Gong in 2013. In other words, in 9 provinces in China, Falun Gong practitioners who had never, who were not in jail, not in prison, they had were sitting in their homes, and the police would arrive and say, "We have to give you a health check," and they would give them a DNA cheek swab and a blood test, right? Now, when I first heard about that in 2013, I thought that's just a warning. They're trying to scare them, right? It's a little bit like when the Nazis were making everybody register who had Jewish grandparents or any, you know, sort of racial registration that went on in Holland, something like that. I thought this is sort of a scare tactic which might turn serious, but maybe won't. Actually, I think that was because they were starting to run out of Falun Gong at that time in 2013, as early as that. But at this point, by 2015, they appear to have solved the problem. 2016, if you don't mind, I'll just move through this fairly quickly.
Yeah, please.
Clues that kind of accumulate very fast after that. 2016, and some of your audience may have seen this on the web, you get these massive re-education, so-called re-education camps being built all over Xinjiang, all over. And they start very small, and then they mushroom very quickly. They're very big construction programs. You can look them up for yourself. It's very easy. Just say Xinjiang camps and do an image search on Google. You'll see them instantly, these vast ones that have appeared in Google Earth and have grown very, very fast. Now, what you have is about 1 million to 3 million people who are then put into those camps. So by the end of 2016, you've got at least 1 million, maybe 1.5 million. By 2017, which at least I think it's about 2 million. But it's again, it's hard to gauge because they're not all involved in labor. And usually the way we try to count these things is by using economic outputs, goods that are produced in a labor camp, that kind of thing. And from that, we can kind of get an estimate of how many people might be there, right? So if we can find how many mountain bikes came out of, such and such camp, we can make a crude estimate of how many people worked on those mountain bikes, right? We can't do that here because they're not really producing very much. These camps are pretty much just purely punitive and re-education or propaganda and so forth. Now, okay, so we have a vast section of the population disappearing, a little bit weighted towards the men, but not completely. A lot of women are going in too, and a fair amount of young people as well. That is the condition. Then I get a call from Gulchera Hoja, who's a very smart reporter at Radio Free Asia, and she says, "Ethan, I've discovered something. What do you think of this?" And she says they're building 9 crematoriums in Xinjiang. And she says the first one's completed. It's in Urumqi, which is the capital. And we discovered that they're hiring 50 security guards. Now, 50 security guards, you think of a crematorium, I mean, you might think of 2 or 3 security guards. In a place like China, maybe 5 because labor is cheaper. But no, 50 security guards. They put the ad in the paper, in a Chinese paper. The salary is $1,200 a month, which is incredibly high for that region. This isn't this is a plum job, actually. 50 security guards means, well, we're talking about a scale of crematorium that we don't have in the West. And that's the first of 9 that are planned. At the same time, we start seeing pictures of human organ fast lanes in the airports in Urumqi. It's a green lane. It's got an arrow, and it says in Chinese and in English, human organs, right? Special lane. Okay.
So this is for somebody carrying human organs to go through?
We don't know. The assumption is that we're talking about organs which have been extracted in Xinjiang and then are going to fly to the East Coast in China. That's the assumption, but we
And,
may be wrong. It
and
could
we
be
got and we got to move this along. This is like overnight delivery of your lobsters or crabs or something.
very. You got to move it along very fast because you only have a limited amount of time with these organs before they can't
Oh,
be used anymore. And usually, it used to be like 4 hours. Now you can push it up to almost 16 because of a technique called ECMO, which
okay.
oxygenates the organs.
And obviously the implication. I mean, I know I'm hitting on the obvious here, but is that not only is that what we have to do, but there are so many such organs being moved that we're justified in having a separate lane at the airport for this.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we actually know the origins of this one because there is a very famous heart surgeon, Dr. Chen, from, I believe, Shanghai Zhongshan Hospital, who once was delivering an organ, I believe, from someplace, Guangdong or somewhere like that, and was flying it up to transplant it into somebody. And the plane was kind of late, and he couldn't get through security fast enough, and he said these organs are worthless now, and he really had a big temper tantrum or whatever. I mean, maybe it's legitimate, but he said, look, the patient's now going to die. And after that, they started putting in a few dedicated lanes, though we never really saw any pictures of anything like this except in Xinjiang. Okay, so the dedicated transplant lane, actually having a special lane that's equal to every other lane of traffic in an airport and can clear through every bit of bureaucracy, that's new. And it's only in Xinjiang, to our knowledge. We've only seen pictures of that happening in Urumqi Airport, Kashgar Airport, and I believe one other, maybe Khotan. I'm not sure about the other one. But these two are very well established. I mean, we not only have pictures of it from sort of activist types, but also Japanese tourists who said, "Isn't this curious?" and stuck it on Instagram, right? What a weird thing. Why they put them in English as well, that just shocks me. I don't know. I don't understand it. But there we go. So we have these things coming together. And finally, what we have is witnesses. And this is where my investigation comes in. There have been very, very few people coming out of Xinjiang, out of the camps. If you say that the Chinese learned something, maybe they learned something from my book, which was don't let people out of these camps. Don't let them out of the country because somebody will interview them. Okay. So very few have made it out. And very few Uyghurs. It's about 10. It's just over 10. The main place that they were coming out were Kazakhs, because Kazakhs actually have a country, right? The Uyghurs have a country. Right now, it's called China, right? The Kazakhs actually have a country, and it's called Kazakhstan. And that country may be very weak, and it may be controlled largely in security forces through the Russians, but it still has a country, and they can, push these issues. So if somebody's, say, married to, if it's a Kazakh woman or even a Uyghur woman who's married to a Kazakh guy and they've got dual passports or something like that, it's possible to get these people out occasionally, right? And that has been the main conduit for what we're finding out about the camps. So inside these camps, the really curious thing is that, well, there was one woman who came out, Saryagul, and I interviewed her. Nobody, she'd been interviewed a lot of times, but she'd never been interviewed on this. And I asked her, tell me about the health checks. And she said, yeah, we used to have them a health check in camp. Everybody who enters the camp is given a health check. And she's a Chinese teacher in this camp, the one she's in. And so she was given some special privileges. In other words, she got to sort of hang out in the equivalent of the faculty lounge, even though she slept on the floor like everybody else in the cold and on the floor of the cement floor. Nonetheless, she was given a few special privileges, so she saw some things. One of the things she saw was these lists. After they did a health check of all the prisoners, and this is the same health check they're given in the outside world, the list would come back, and there'd be 3 check marks. And those 3 people would disappear over the next couple of days. Okay. Now, this was directly based on their health. And I asked her, what's the average age? What drew these people in? What was the commonality of these people who disappeared in the middle of the night? And they basically were about 28 years old on average. In other words, 25 to 35, approximately in that range or age range. Now that's very significant because within the medical world in China, they have determined for a number of years now, it's almost 10 years, that they've determined that the best age to harvest somebody for their organs is the age 28 because you are at the peak of your health. At the same time, your organs have stopped growing, they've reached maturity, and the body has not yet started to really deteriorate the way it will for the rest of your life. Yeah. So age 28 is ideal. And it didn't matter if they were male or female, age 28 is the age that comes through. And that's the most significant age for people who disappear from the camps. So it's not the old people, it's young. And it's not the super young because the 18-year-olds are sent off, and they often, what they call it graduation. They announce at the cafeteria, so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, they're all graduating. They're all going off to work in some wonderful factory, probably making American goods. And that's a whole issue of, I don't mean to minimize it or joke about it. I don't like the tone that just came into my voice there. That's a very serious issue. These people's lives are ruined. They're treated as slave labor. But nonetheless, let's separate that out for a minute because we're talking about organ harvesting here. The second group that disappears is approximately 25 to 35, right in that age range, and they are done in the middle of the night. They simply disappear. Nobody knows where they went. This is the group that is being harvested. And so my struggle over the last year has been to try to put numbers onto that, to try to get some sense of how big this scale is. And I don't do this for perverse reasons. I mean, I used to say that there's a deep human need for numbers, and that's really kind of facile. The fact is, we look at numbers because we're in a world where we have many, many competing priorities, and we need to make a kind of utilitarian calculation. Is this something I ought to be paying attention to? Well, if it's, obviously, if it's 100 people a year, that's too bad, but it's shocking, but it's maybe something we don't have to make. We don't have to turn into a major issue. On the other hand, what if I told you that my minimum number is 25,000? Okay, per year. That's my minimum number. And I've just come out with that. That's assuming I'm going with witnesses. I went to Kazakhstan. That's a whole story in itself. If I did that, I interviewed a lot of people who no one has interviewed before. Interviewed them confidentially. A lot of them, I can't reveal their names. A lot of them were just interviewed on an old-fashioned dictaphone, so that there'd be no chance of me putting it onto a hard drive, which could be read. Yeah.
Right.
But out of that, what was coming through was there was surprisingly, and these were all people from completely different camps, but the common the numbers were so close. I mean, yes, there were a few people who came out and said, nobody in my camp disappeared. There was another guy who said 20% of my camp disappeared. And this was an enormous camp, like 5,000 people. But those are outliers. Most of them were it was about 5% who disappeared. Or it was about 2.5%. If we go to the lower number, right, of 2.5%, and we assume that there's 1 million people in the camps, which is absolutely the lowest number you can come up with. It's a fairly simple calculation. You're at 25,000 people. These people are being harvested, and that makes some sense. Even the low number makes some sense because those people are good for 2 or 3 organs each. So we're already up to the totals that we expect, which are about 60,000, 70,000 transplants per year at a minimum. That's what I have.
So let's just to kind of take stock of this right now. Let's go with your 25,000 a year number. Mm-hmm. I think you did a very good job of laying out all the caveats because it sounds to me like that number could be many times higher than that, but let's go with that. Over the course of how many years? In other words, what's the total
We think that
so
it's been
far?
going on approximately 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. Okay. I have no view on this year because of the COVID crisis that's distorted things. We don't know. The numbers might be, well, we'll get into that in a minute. But I think for those, at least those 3 years, 2017, 2018, 2019, I think this is the reasonable minimum estimate of what's going on out
Okay,
there.
so we're well above 100,000 people that have, even going with this low number.
Yeah, sure. We are well above 100,000 people at this
I
point.
mean, it could
As I
be,
said, this is the really rock bottom number that I could come up with.
understand, it could be, we could be talking 3, 4, 5 times that for all we know. I mean, again,
We
that's
could be. We could
okay.
be.
And this is
Yeah.
on, to the best of our knowledge. I mean, I get it that you're as you should be, being careful and you're being precise. So bringing this completely current, given especially what's going on in the world, is kind of impossible. But there's no indication that this has stopped, I guess, is what I'm getting
Well, my assumption, again, I'm the optimist here, Sam. I'm always kind of,
at.
I don't know what it is. I'm a little Mary Sunshine here.
given
I
given
always,
your subject matter, that's a really an amazing accomplishment. That's
I don't know
wow.
what it is about me, but I'm always like, well, here's the COVID crisis. At least there's a silver lining to, the Wuhan virus, which is, they're really going to have to cut out the organ harvesting for a while. That's going to really retract because who wants to go to a Chinese hospital, particularly foreigners, right? But I was wrong again. The Chinese outfoxed me as usual. What did they do? They announced this was about a month, maybe 5 weeks ago or so. They announced, well, we just did two lungs. We replaced two lungs in a COVID patient whose lungs were shot, and we put in two fresh new lungs, and they're doing really well. Now, they didn't just announce this in some internal paper or something. They put it in China Daily. They put it in English. They put it. They made sure that everybody in the West read it. Now, a lot of people in my field sort of jumped on that and said, "Where did they get the organs?" Well, I mean, to me, it's obvious where they got the organs. They're probably Uyghur organs, and maybe they're Falun Gong or Tibetan or something. But yeah, I agree that of course that's where they got the organs is from prisoners. But the real meaning of the thing was it was an advertisement to the world. It was saying we are open for business. Do not think that we've stopped doing this. We're open. Come on in. The water's fine. Probably the prices are lower too. Okay. They didn't say anything about that, but they did suggest that there was. And by the way, if you get COVID and you need your lungs replaced, maybe this will work. Okay. Now they haven't just done that one that was very splashy. They've done quite a few since then, and so this has been announced over and over again. But maybe they were advertising for the West. Maybe they were advertising for Saudi Arabia. I don't know. Maybe both. But this was an advertisement. So they are open, apparently. And they're trying to, tell people in China as well, because there are plenty of somewhat wealthy people in China who will pay for new organs. But they're definitely going after the foreign organ market on that one. And I think that's very significant. So we don't know what's going on at this point and how COVID is affecting things. That's one of the Chinese hallmarks is usually they sort of say, let's forget about what happened a month ago. Let's just concentrate on the now. You see this in the COVID crisis. And they're always saying that, right? It's like, who cares how this virus started? Let's get, it's like we all got to work together to stop it.
Yes. Nothing to see. Nothing to see here. Move along.
Nothing to move along, for God's sake. I mean, they're always saying this. And this is now they're, to some extent, they're trying to do that with harvesting, except they could not resist. You see, that industry is so big that they have to advertise. They can't have these surgeons. They have surgical teams, 4 surgical teams in most of the major hospitals, 4 surgical teams ready to do transplants. So they can't have these guys sitting on their hands. They've got to use them.
So the people getting these, I mean, we're talking, again, we'll go with the 25,000 number with all of the caveats that you've very effectively laid out. And multiple organs typically from each person who is harvested.
That is correct.
Okay, so now we've got multiples of 25,000 every year. Again, that's the low end of people who are actually receiving organs.
That's correct.
I'm assuming, going back to the previous segment, that we're still talking about a very large portion of these people who are receiving these organs being foreigners who are specifically traveling to China to get transplants. Is that correct?
Well, we don't know what the percentage is of those who are foreign. Clearly, they are the desirable recipients for China, uh, for the Chinese medical industry, because they pay 10 times as much, approximately 7 to 10 times as much. Okay. Uh, in some cases, if you're talking about Japanese, they pay sometimes 20 or 30 times as much because they hate to bargain. But they are coming in and, yes, paying top dollar for these. What percentage what percentage are Han Chinese or just regular citizens of China? We don't know. The assumption is something like, approximately three-quarters have to be from inside China, and there's a huge demand inside China, especially for lungs. Even before COVID, the pollution, as you know, is very, very bad in China. And it wrecks people's lungs. I mean, a lot of these businessmen get older and they're healthy in every other way and they're well fed, but their lungs are shot and they need new ones. So all of these, and then there's a lot of pollution causes a lot of other problems, as you know. Uh, so the demand is there. We're not concerned too much about the demand. Clearly, for the Chinese, though, to make this really, really profitable, you want to get those foreign organ tourists in there. And that is why we know that they have been, an aspect of this is they have been, we've never seen the actual advertisements, but I do have some information which pretty much clarifies that the Saudis are particularly prized as consumers on this one. I guess the assumption here is that these are being used as halal organs and advertised that way. These are the Uyghurs. The Falun Gong eat pork. They may not smoke, they may not drink, they may do this very healthy exercises, but they eat pork. And the Muslims, the Xinjiang Muslims, the Uyghurs, the Hui, the Kazakhs, and the Kyrgyz do not eat pork. And that is a big issue for Saudi organ tourists. So that has been promoted. And I can not give you any numbers on that. Our assumption, my assumption based on what I know, is that the Saudis are doing this directly through the consulate. Okay? This is not sort of look one way. This is not illicit. This is government to government relations. Okay? These are state relations. That's how it's being operated on. We know with the Japanese, it's done more like a tour group. They do a lot, and they all go to the China-Japan Friendship Hospital and so forth. We know we've gone through this, I think, in a previous episode, talked a little bit about that, about how there are sort of national characteristics to how this is done. But in the case of the Saudis, that has become a major market. On the other hand, we also know that, I was mucking around with the Wayback Machine on the web, and it's possible to go back in time and look at these original Chinese websites. So they had one for basically geared towards foreign organ tourists in one of the biggest hospitals in China for transplants, and that is Tianjin Central Hospital. It's very close to Beijing, about an hour away by fast train. That one had two languages you could access when you were approaching the website. One was English, the other was Arabic. So that goes way back to 2013, I believe, 2014. That's been there for a while. So that, from my perspective, I think that's been more than a gleam in their eye for some time. But we can't push this all on the Saudis. I mean, there are Westerners going, there are Americans going.
So let me shift gears here, because we're kind of coming toward the end of this segment and of these portions, and I got at least 2 points I'd like to hit. One is, you have painted out very effectively and very, I think, authoritatively over the course of these 3 segments the scope of this horror story. And you've obviously written about it extensively and talked about it extensively, as have other people. How in the name of God is it possible that there are licensed medical professionals outside of China around the world who have to know exactly where these organs are coming from, and yet on a large scale continue to send people to China for transplants. Because as you have laid out, this is not that there aren't back alley operations, but this is a long way from a back alley operation. This is a really state-run, massive enterprise. And therefore, if I'm sitting anywhere, the United States, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and I'm a doctor and I'm sending somebody off to China for an organ, I straight up, I have to know. Yeah, and they're going to rip those organs out of a political prisoner while he or she is still alive to stick them into my patient, and then, of course, murder the person who was this involuntary donor. How can this be going on worldwide still, year after year after year? Because to me, what a condemnation of the worldwide medical profession.
I think the simple answer is denial. The human capacity, even among doctors, for denial is incredible. I mean, they will, China will give them an excuse. We'll sort of say, well, that's not happening. And they'll say, well, there's questions about that, because the Chinese say it's not happening. Look, we've seen this. Is that really so strange? I mean, look, we've seen this in the COVID crisis. The Chinese numbers were so obviously made up, right? They were following a perfect epidemic curve in Wuhan. It was clear that the numbers, it became very obvious very quickly that they were obviously, there were a lot more deaths than they were letting on, right? Maybe 10 times as much, maybe just 4 times as much. We don't know exactly. It depends if you're counting funeral urns or canceled or canceled China Telecom mobile subscriptions. It just depends on what count you want to take. But we know the numbers aren't accurate. Look how long people stuck to them. Look how long the medical world. Look at the WHO, right? The World Health Organization stuck to this stuff. So they have. Let me give you another example, though, a little bit different. This is a book. There was a very popular book. It was a lot more popular than my book, by the guy named Daniel Rose. He's a kind of comedian, and he wrote a book called Larry's Kidney. Where he goes off and gets his really awful relative, Uncle Larry, and helps him get a kidney in China. And he has all these adventures and these gorgeous Chinese girls and all this sort of stuff. And it's very, very obvious that when he asks about the origins of this kidney that's going to be transplanted into his cousin, the doctor who he asks, who's the head of the transplant wing, Dr. X, I call him, he calls him Dr. X, and he says, do you mind if I ask who the donor is? And I'm just reading aloud. He says, this is one of Rose's favorite things to do, is to use, to make fun of Chinese English, Chinese Chinglish. So this bad criminal, Dr. X says, 31 years of age and already killed many people. Break in woman's house, kill woman's father, then decide he want no witness. So come back and kill woman and woman's baby. Very bad man. I would kill him 100 times. Now, and, he says the guy was 31 years old. And that is probably true, 31 years. But anyone listening to a response like that would say, this is a stupid story. It's not only a lie, it's a bad lie, right? Comes back and kills baby, right? Bad criminal. No, but he buys it in the book. Okay, he buys it. He sort of makes a joke of it. He sort of says, watching for a minute there, he's a little upset, but it's kind of like seeing a lamb prancing in front of you who's going to be that evening's veal piccata. But this is, he goes off and writes this book, this jolly book, actually served as an advertisement for the organ harvesting industry of China. And it became kind of a bestseller. In fact, they were going to make a major movie of it in Hollywood.
Good God.
Yeah, no, Will Ferrell was supposed to be Larry. Was supposed to play Larry.
Oh my God. That
Yeah, oh my God, right? And
if you made that up, it could not be more
I
ludicrous.
wrote I wrote the producers. I wrote them a note and just not an irate note. I just said, hey, why don't you look at my book? I think there's some problems going on with this. And the producers never got back to me, but apparently the movie got shelved. And
Yeah, that's a great idea. I mean, why we should have a musical set in a concentration camp like Dachau. That I mean,
yeah,
that makes about that's kind of on a par for this. I mean, you're talking about just the same kind of thing, people being exterminated in vast numbers, and we're supposed to pretend like this is funny. This is, oh my
yeah,
God.
there's something really wrong with that. I mean, that picture is incredible. I mean, the guy Daniel Rose was very angry at me, and I could understand why. I'm sure he was looking forward to his book being made into a movie and so forth. And he said, "Well, no, we're going to stand up and tell people to become voluntary donors. Like that's going to make it all okay." Uh, this is no, this the medical world has. I'm kind of making light of it now. But the medical world has failed dramatically in this one, and the fact is they hold the cards because the media will never. The media covers this. At least the major papers have all covered this issue now and covered it in a somewhat serious way, where they say, well, there are question marks about this and there are arguments about the scale, and some people say it's not happening, but there's some strong evidence that it is happening, and so forth. And that includes the New York Times, includes across the political spectrum, uh, people have covered it in every major paper. Now, I don't expect Fox News to drone on about this every night. I don't expect Rachel Maddow to care about this. TV doesn't care about what goes on in China generally. Okay, it's just not their. That's not their. That's not what gets viewers. But it has been understood. Congress has passed resolutions on this. Pompeo has been mentioning it more and more. He's veering closer and closer to talking about this. And so the problem here is that the medical world holds the cards. They are the ones who can change this. Because there is one thing they can do which would really damage China and damage their pride and would damage the thing they care about the most, which is the money. And that is simply to ostracize the entire transplant community of China. Right now, transplant surgeons from China can come over and study in our universities. They can publish in our medical journals all over the West, top medical journals. They come to our conferences, the Transplantation Society's conferences every year. They have a huge one. They held it in Hong Kong one year. It was dominated by transplant surgeons from China. These people are butchers. They have personally butchered human beings while they were still alive. This all has to come to an end. And people act, sometimes people have acted a little shocked when I've said this, but the truth is there's a precedent for this. You and me are old enough to certainly remember the Soviet psychiatrists. Yes?
Sure.
Soviet psychiatrists were not allowed to publish in our psychological psychiatry journals of psychiatry or psychology. They weren't invited to our conferences. They weren't allowed to go to our universities. They were shunned because we knew that they were torturing political dissidents. Because if you disagreed with the Soviet state, you could end up in a mental hospital, heavily drugged and tortured. Yeah, and this wasn't a Democrat or Republican issue. This was across the board. The World Psychiatric Association would denounce the Soviet psychiatric industry every year, and they did it till all the way to the end of the Cold War. Right? That was the position that was taken. We couldn't have a dialogue with them because there was no reform. The time for reform was over. What they had done was an aberration. It was a perversion of medicine. And I think this stands as a perversion of medicine. Honestly, I don't care if they stop doing it tomorrow. There are a lot of bodies here. There are a lot of families which are due compensation, apology, recognition. That's not happening. There's nothing suggesting that's ever going to happen in China with the current regime. Yeah. So to me, this is the natural move. Is we do exactly what we did in the Cold War. We ostracize the Soviet psychiatrists in the Cold War. We ostracize the Chinese transplant surgeons now.
So yeah, I mean, couldn't possibly agree with you more. And I mean, I was thinking as you were talking, look, what was our response to apartheid in South Africa, which was a reprehensible system, but to my knowledge did not include the dismemberment of living people. And yet we took very firm, concerted worldwide economic action against that regime. And yet we're going to tolerate this. So last question for you to kind of close out these three segments. I'm listening to this. I've listened to all three segments. I'm outraged. I'm mad as hell. To steal the quote from the movie, I'm not going to take it anymore. Average American, what do I do?
Talk to your doctor. Talk to your dentist. I mean, talk to anyone who's involved in the medical field and just simply ask the question. Have you thought about this? Have you heard about this? You read anything on this? Would you like to read something? I can throw you this link. Okay, that's all they need to do. This is the critical thing. I don't believe in petitions. I don't believe they really have much effect, and they sort of give people the illusion of doing something. The truth is, you will never be persuaded on this issue, and you shouldn't be, until you sit down and read one thing on it. You know, one long-form essay, one book, one report. The two reports I'd suggest right now are basically we have the London China Tribunal, which looked at the evidence for the last 2 years, and these were objective people. Only one of them was a doctor. The other, it was run by Sir Geoffrey Nice, who's arguably the best human rights prosecutor in the world today. And you know, look through the London China Tribunals. It's there on the web. Go to Victims of Communism website. There's a terrific report. It's for free. It's done by Matt Robertson. It also assesses the evidence. These are terrific reports. They don't take you that long to go through. And then do what is really important, which is talk to your doctor. If you have a politician, any connection to a politician, talk to them. But the key thing of the doctors, everyone in the medical world needs to feel the heat of this thing.
So, and your book is
my
the Slaughter.
My book's much more fun to read than those reports. But you know, I'll leave that for you people to decide. My book's out there. The PDF is pretty good value. I think it's still only $10. And to tell you the truth, probably if you muck around in the web and go to some skeezy Russian website, you can probably find a PDF for $0. You know, but God knows what it'll put on your computer.
Well, we don't want to. Yeah, that's right. No, that's exactly right. You'll read it one time, but you'll be buying a new computer. That's what you'll be doing.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of an expensive proposition.
Yeah,
really, the $10 for the PDF is a pretty good deal.
Your keyboard will be smoking before you're done talking.
I know. And as a writer, look, I get a little more from the PDFs. Truthfully, it's better. We sort of cut out the publisher and the middleman on that a little bit. I shouldn't say that, or my agent get mad.
Yeah, that's right. You're getting a couple of phone calls. Ethan, I want to thank you for taking a huge amount of time to walk us through this, because I got to tell you that before you and I started the first segment, I was mad as hell. I'm about 10 times as mad right now. I mean, we're laughing because that's the way you react to dealing with really horrible subjects sometimes, to defuse the tension. But the idea that you got real human beings being torn apart while still alive to feed so the communist Chinese can pocket hard currency, and while the medical profession looks the other way, it is a horror movie. And I want to really thank you for dedicating yourself to opening our eyes to it.
Well, I want to thank you for pulling the whole thing out big canvas style for three segments. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
This will, you know, I'm hoping that this will be out there as a kind of a legacy and a kind of a snapshot of where we were at this time. I'm afraid this story is not over.
I see no indication from listening to you that it's over. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks a lot, Sam. Cheers.
And thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time on Ground Truth.